Today it's a quaint French village with narrow streets, a big belfry on the town hall, and a market day every Thursday. But once it was a critical fortification, a star fortress, a key objective in the massive wars of the 16th and 17th century. Our map is like an aerial photograph, taken in 1575. Except there's something odd about this map. Several things, really. Have you found them yet? Welcome to the Eye of History. Every video here starts with a map from my collection, an entry point into investigations into history, economics, science, technology, and more. If you're the curious sort and enjoy fresh perspectives on old topics, then hit the subscribe button and join the adventure. The Civitatis Orbis Terrarum is certainly the most interesting atlas ever published. Starting about 1572, George Braun and Franz Hogenberg began the process of creating what they hoped would be a comprehensive atlas of all the world's cities. They scoured Europe for examples and invited contributions from the public, eventually assembling over 500 maps of cities from Cuzco to Constantinople. I own a couple examples. This one is like a conventional map of the time, with the buildings portrayed in an almost medieval perspective. These two are more like portraits, but it's this third one that I find particularly fascinating. It's quite striking. It's of Hesdin, a place name now nearly forgotten but was once almost legendary in France. The original Hesdin was a castle belonging to the Count of Artois, famous in medieval times for its incredible gardens. The name sounded like Eden, and poets rhymed it with a biblical garden in many a romance. Typical was the 14th century classic, The Remedy of Fortune, a poem in which a beleaguered hero takes refuge in the gardens of Hesdin, and while resting amid its wonders, he receives a vision from the Lady of Hope. But though the gardens of Hesdin were a symbol of serenity and felicity in the 14th century, in the 15th century it becomes something even greater. The Dukes of Burgundy took them over, and there was no gem the Dukes of Burgundy weren't anxious to polish to the extreme. 3 generations of dukes lavished their attention on Hesdin. They added fish ponds and fountains, a menagerie, an aviary, a hedge maze. They bred herons to live there year-round, and they raised deer and rabbits, of course. They built a banquet pavilion with pipe organ and mirror palace, and pranks, fitting the medieval sense of humor. A trapdoor into a room of feathers, pipes that squirted the unwary with water, soot, or flour. And most famous, the automatons. The first in Europe north of Sicily. Mechanical monkeys, singing birds, a gesturing king. Kings and emperors came to visit and marvel. But the wonders of Hesdin could not last forever, not considering where Hesdin is located. Not 10 miles from Agincourt, 20 from Dunkirk. This has always been a dangerous neighborhood, especially so in the 16th century, as the Holy Roman Empire and France battled each other in no fewer than 4 wars in succession. It was in the 4th of these wars, in 1553, that the armies of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, came to Hesdin. It took only 2 weeks for the imperial cannon to breach the castle walls. The fragile gardens had already been ruined by then. The emperor was not going to defend his newly won territory with fish ponds and menageries. Almost immediately, he ordered the construction of a new Hesdin. This Hesdin. Not gardens, but bastions. Not fountains, but cannon. Our map captures the state of Hesdin just 20 years later. Let's take a look around the map. The cartouche text says, Hesdinum castle and town were built to be impregnable during the war between our emperor and the French that they aroused. I should mention that Braun and Hogenberg lived on the emperor's side of the border, so clearly they had to say the French had started the war. These empty blasons are strange. Most of the Civitatis maps included the coats of arms of the local lords. and I really don't know why we don't see the blason of Philip II here. There's a lot of open space. In fact, there's no attempt to show any detail of the area outside the city walls at all. Just some blank fields and scattered trees that look to have been drawn just to fill the space. This is the norm, actually, for the maps in this atlas. It lives up to its title exactly: the cities of the world, and no more. The couple in the lower corner were a staple of the Civitates maps. Braun and Hogenberg enjoyed showing how the locals dressed. Other cartographers picked up on this idea, and these sorts of figures became parts of elaborate cartouches in later maps. Inside the city, we see a central square and some hundreds of houses arranged neatly in an irregular grid. These seem to be drawn with considerable care. We can't verify the accuracy directly. None of these houses still stand. But other Civitates maps have proven to be quite faithful. We see a central keep. It seems a bit idealized, more like the medieval Hesdin than part of a modern star fortress. There's no church yet in the town, or city hall. Work on a town hall would start in 1563, but it would take 66 years to complete. The church was started in 1565 and would take 120 years. Only California builds things on a slower schedule. The river seems carelessly drawn. There's an odd island with two tiny houses but no bridge to access them. Two of the main streets don't seem to have a bridge. It took me a moment to figure out the waterworks. Just upstream of the city, a weir diverts some of the river water into the city, and the rest flows into the moat. On the downstream side, the river is channeled across the moat. I assume to keep the moat clean, the river being surely filled with sewage that would get washed into it while it meandered through the town. The amount of open space is striking. We have an idea that old towns were crowded places. It's true that the streets were narrow by modern standards, no cars and trucks driving through, but in most towns, individual houses often had room for gardens, and sometimes there were even small farms entirely within the walls. In the case of Hesdin, it's important to understand the relationship between the fortifications and the people. The walls were not there to protect the people. There were plenty of peasants in Picardy outside those walls. The 1,000 or so inside the walls were not all such important figures as to merit so much protection. Rather, the people were there to maintain the fortifications, not so much by working on the walls themselves, but by, in the ordinary course of their lives, making sure that the gardens, waterworks, and such didn't fall into disrepair. So when the war reached the city, and the emperor rushed his army to its battlements, the gardens and granaries would not be empty, and the moat would be functional. The empty space was there to house the defending army when it was needed. It could be farmed, of course, whenever war was distant, and fortress towns like Hesdin sometimes grew to fill their walls, but Hesdin never did. Let's take a look at these fortifications. There is something wrong here. Let me show you some diagrams of what these fortresses are supposed to look like. Here's a particularly good pentagonal example, which should match Hesdin. But it doesn't. The proportions are off. The bastions of Hesdin are much too small. We see some spade-shaped bastions in this other diagram, but not so elaborate. And these concave curves we see here are obvious weak points. Either the emperor had a really bad engineer on the job, or this artist was really careless. But those are minor glitches compared with the big problem. Have you seen it yet? I have to admit, I'd been looking at the map for at least 15 minutes before I realized it. There are no gates. There's no way in or out of Hesdin. We can guess where they should have been. The main roads, then and now, came from the northeast, southeast, and southwest, and we've seen in this video how little these roadways changed their paths over the centuries. The gates would have likely been here and here and here. But this is more than weird. Why would you make a map of a city and leave out the gates? The houses and streets are shown in fine detail, but the fanciful bastions must have been a deliberate decision made by someone who didn't want to give up any tactically useful information about Hesdin, someone who didn't want to be hung as a spy. I think that someone was not the man who first sketched Hesdin and sent his map to Braun and Hogenberg, I think it was Braun and Hogenberg themselves. To my eye, it appears that this map was made by two different people, one who was very proud of Hesdin and drew the houses and streets with considerable care, and someone else who was just making things up as he went along. I think the first artist included much more than just the building and streets. I think the second artist erased or ignored the parts that were too dangerous to print. So everything in this part of the map is true and good, and everything outside is pure invention. The more I look at the map in detail, the more convinced I am of the truth of it. The only flaw in my theory is the waterworks, which seems to be reasonably correct. I suppose our conjectured editor did not consider the river to be too important? There you have it. I'm not sure I have anything else like it in my collection. A very good map, hidden within a preposterous one. So we know that much of the map is nonsensical, but is the good part actually good? Let's compare it with Google. We can use where the river enters and exits as reference points. Those two spots should not have moved much, and it appears that the town square hasn't moved either. And it looks pretty good. Our map was obviously not the product of a detailed survey, so much of the difference is just the artist's error. The main streets seem intact, but most of the minor streets seem to have filled in. The most prominent difference is that the open spaces are gone. With our map, we can now see where the old castle used to be. And what is there now? It looks like a pretty nice place. From what I can tell, it's now a private residence. We won't pry any further. But it's interesting that it isn't just the streets that survive. The land use has hardly changed in 450 years. The old bastions are still relatively open space, and the walls have become highways. You can see the same pattern in most of these old fortress towns. So, yes, it was a pretty good map in its time, reasonably accurate before it was edited into absurdity, and it's gratifying that Hesdin has managed to preserve at least some of its original character. As for the collectability of this map, maps from the Civitates Orbis Terrarum are among the most popular maps to collect. Several thousand copies of the atlas were printed over the years, and over 500 different maps in each edition. It was the sort of atlas that people kept around, so today there's a substantial inventory. And with over 500 maps and many different styles, there's a huge range in desirability, and therefore price. It helps that they're all highly frameable. They're quite well documented, which helps considerably to prevent fraud. And all this makes them a great place to start for new collectors. Prices range from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000s, but they often show up in estate sales and auctions at really good values. Although you always have to be careful about condition when working through an auction house rather than an experienced dealer. In sum, I don't know if there's a better collectible that is this old, this attractive, and this easy to get started with. But I know I'm biased. If you share my bias for maps, then hit that like button. YouTube needs to know that people like us exist.